Hello, my name is Corey Malcolm, and I am the Director of Archaeology for the Mel Fisher Maritime Museum in Key West, Florida. The doomed 1622 Tierra Firme fleet is best known for the modern day discoveries of treasures that have been brought up from the wrecks of the galleons Atocha and Santa Margarita. But what were the original circumstances of these ships? What was the fleet doing? Who was sailing on the ships? How did the disaster unfold? And how did the Spanish colonists respond to the situation? I put together a presentation that explores the answers to those questions. This presentation is called the Tierra Firme Fleet Disaster, Wreck, Rescue, and Recovery, and it looks at the history of the 1622 fleet from within the context of the Spanish colonial period. First off, I want to dedicate this presentation to the late Eugene Lyon. Dr. Lyon pioneered the historical research into the 1622 fleet, and his work has been the foundation of this presentation. Let's start at the beginning of the Spanish colonial period. In 1492, Columbus crossed the Atlantic Ocean, expecting to find the Orient. Instead, he found previously unknown lands, at least to the Europeans, that would soon be called the Americas. Though he never quite understood what exactly he had done or found, Columbus's voyage was consequential because it showed that a transatlantic crossing was not just possible, but repeatable. In the first decades after Columbus, the Americas underwent a rapid process of conquest and colonization by the Spanish. Riches of many types were found in the New World, and commercial systems began to be established to take advantage of them. By the mid-1500s, a transatlantic circuit called the Carrera de Indias was established, and for the next 2 centuries, thousands of ships sailed through the North Atlantic in a clockwise route from Spain to the New World in organized, well-defended fleets. In 1616, King Philip III ordered 4 new guard galleons for the Carrera fleets to be built in Havana by the shipwright Alonso Ferreira. The galleon Nuestra Senora de Atocha was one of these. It was a 550-ton vessel, roughly 110 feet long, and built of Cuban mahogany and oak-like tabibua. Atocha was completed in 1620, the last of the 4 to be built under the Ferreira contract. The galleon was named after the Virgin of Atocha, who is housed in a basilica in Madrid and is the oldest patron saint of that city, and is also the traditional protector of the royal family. Atocha made its first voyage from Havana to Seville in 1620, but shortly after departing its mainmast broke and it had to return for a new one. The galleon left again and arrived in Spain in late 1620 in a leaky condition. After extensive repairs, Atocha was made part of the 1622 Tierra Firme fleet, a group of ships bound for the ports of Caribbean South America. Atocha was designated the Almirante, or rear guard ship, and it carried 20 bronze cannon and a complement of soldiers for this mission. The 600-ton Viscayan-built galleon Santa Margarita sailed too as one of the fleet's guard galleons. The convoy of ships sailed March 23rd from Cadiz, Spain. By March 30th, they had sighted Gran Canaria Island, and on April 24th, they completed their transatlantic crossing, making landfall at Dominica. Some of the smaller ships in the fleet went their own way from that point. May 24th, the main part of the fleet arrived at Cartagena on May 2nd, and there they delivered passengers and traded European goods with the colonists there. 2 weeks later, once they had conducted their business, they left for Portobello in Panama. On May 24th, the fleet arrived at Portobello and unloaded cargo there. 4 million pesos of European goods and 250 tons of mercury. They then waited for treasure from South America to arrive. And at last, on July 3rd, mule trains loaded with treasure began to arrive in the port. The treasure and Spain-bound passengers were put on board. The main cargo of the fleet was silver from the mines of South America. 90% of Atocha's silver was from the Potosí mine high in the Andes Mountains. When the ships had finished loading, the fleet sailed again for Cartagena, and they arrived there on July 27th. In Cartagena, they took on additional treasure, loads of tobacco, and more Spain-bound passengers. On August 3rd, the fleet sailed for Havana, and the ships arrived there on August 22nd. At that Cuban port, they loaded copper, indigo, personal goods, and additional silver from Mexico's ships. A total of 28 ships of the fleet convened in Havana to sail together to Spain. Many people with many different roles were on the ships. The Atocha carried 270 people, Margarita 195. And there were some pretty interesting people on board these ships, and it's worth taking a look at a few of them just to get a sense of the social structures at the time. First, Bartolome Garcia de Nodal. He was the captain of the troops on the Atocha, but in 1619 he and his brother Gonzalo successfully explored the extreme southern tip of South America, and they discovered and named the Diego Ramirez Islands and pushed the boundaries of the Spanish Empire towards Antarctica. They were in some ways the last of the Spanish explorers. Juan Delgado de Leon was a 36-year-old commission merchant and a resident of Lima since 1620. His father had been in the transatlantic trading business since 1584, and Juan Delgado de Leon was following in his father's footsteps. He was in charge of a large treasure on the galleons, 196 silver ingots on Atocha and Margarita, plus 214 pounds of assorted silverware. Don Diego de Guzman was the disgraced magistrate of Cusco, the ancient Incan city in Peru. He had been appointed to that position in 1614, but in 1618 things went awry. The story's a little complicated, but it's worth telling. A person had been arrested in Cusco, and the crime isn't specified, but whatever it was bad enough that this man was sentenced to death. Well, he had appealed, and his case was sort of dragging on, and he was awaiting a final judgment. And during this time, while they waited, Guzman, another local official, and the prisoner were gambling in the evening in City Hall. And it turned out that after one of their gambling games, the prisoner lost. And the other official seemed to covet a ring that the prisoner was wearing. And apparently, as a way of getting the ring, he began to complain to Guzman that the prisoner's case was moving too slowly, that really justice wasn't being served by this dragging on and this delay. And he encouraged Guzman to sign the death warrant and have the prisoner executed. And that happened, and it happened before dawn that next morning. Well, that caused problems. The prisoner's wife was upset at the quick execution of her husband, and she complained to the viceroy, and he thought something was suspicious about it all, and so he opened an investigation into the situation. Well, the investigation concluded in 1619, and Don Diego de Guzman was not found guilty of the injustice of the execution, but rather he was found guilty of having allowed illegal gambling in a government building, and for that he was removed from office. So Guzman was heading back to Spain on Atocha with a darkened reputation. Doña Isabel de Pernilla, she was a 62-year-old woman who had lived in Peru since 1598. She was traveling to Spain for unknown reasons with quite a fortune. She had 200 pounds of silver in the form of 2 silver ingots, as well as assorted silverware. And here we see a silver plate with Doña Isabel scratched into the underside, her mark. Father Pedro de la Madriz was an Augustinian priest, and his official title was Visitor and Reformer General, and he was essentially an Inspector General. Before sailing to Spain on the Atocha, he had toured Peru and Chile for 1.5 years, again as sort of this Inspector General to assess church operations in the region. On Santa Margarita, Francisco de la Hoz y Barrio, he was the governor of Venezuela. He had grown up in South America, and he was the son of the former governor of Trinidad. Francisco had been appointed governor of Venezuela in 1615. And he's well remembered there. He founded many towns across Venezuela, and those towns, those villages at the time, were specifically for indigenous peoples. And he was helping to get them out of oppressive Spanish systems and getting them into their own space, and where they could be part of the nation, but not be treated so cruelly as they had in the past. And a lot of those towns have survived today. They've grown, and many of them are quite large. And he is remembered as being an advocate for the native peoples of Venezuela. Father Pablo Josef de Arriaga was a Peru-based Jesuit priest. His mission while he was in Peru was to document native religious practices. And he traveled throughout the region writing down what he saw. And he did this not because he was curious or an anthropologist, so to speak. He did it because he wanted to document these native practices and then be able to share what he learned with other priests so they could then be aware of what they were seeing. And then if they caught people practicing their native religion, they could then work to squelch that. So he was trying to actually crush these native practices in favor of Christianity. But the end result was that he was essentially an anthropologist, and his documentation of these native religious practices in Peru, it's considered the best document of its time, and it was published in a book in 1621, and that book is still in print today. So, and it's translated in different languages. So, if you are interested in ordering a copy, they are available. Gaspar de Rojas was a transatlantic merchant who is known to have traded in things like leather, wax, fur, textiles, and silver. He was the agent for over 100 silver bars in the 1622 fleet, 100 ingots on Margarita, and 11 on Atocha. Rojas was a resident of both Lima and Seville, and he traveled fairly frequently between the two. Rojas was 40 years old, and he was described as tall, with red hair and blue eyes. In Havana, it was late August, and the fleet was well behind schedule. The officers of the fleet met, and they discussed what they should do. They were aware it was hurricane season, and questioned whether it was wise to leave then, and perhaps they should delay the voyage. And some said, well, let's leave in winter, but that would only put them into the winter season in Europe, and that would make for a potentially dangerous situation there. Others said, well, let's stay till spring, when the weather will clear again, and that was just too far away. This fleet had a very important treasure, and that treasure was badly needed in Spain, so the economic pressure to leave was very, very strong. So, the end result, they decided that there was a new moon coming on September 5th of 1622, and if they would wait until just before September 5th to see what the weather was like, if it was good, surely it would hold through the new moon and they would be okay. So, on September 4th, the day before the new moon, the weather was calm, serene, and so the fleet left. But while they had dithered, a storm was brewing, and nobody realized it, but a hurricane had formed and was headed their way. By the next morning, the weather began to change. That evening, the merchant ship Consolacion capsized and vanished in the deep water between Cuba and Florida. Through the night, the conditions got worse, and everyone began to realize their fate. Early on the morning of September 6th, people on the Margarita watched Atocha strike the Florida reef and sink below the waves. Margarita soon after grounded in the shallows, and the ship broke apart. By the time the storm was over, 7, possibly 8 ships were lost. The record is a little mixed on the number. Nearly 600 people had died, and a treasure of 200 million pesos was lost on the sea floor. 5 survivors were found clinging to the mizzenmast of the submerged Atocha. Captain Bernardino de Lugo of Margarita was found floating on a plank from the shattered galleon. Bodies of the drowned were recovered from the sea. After his rescue, De Lugo placed a buoy between the 2 wrecks to mark them for later salvage. A few days later, survivors from the galleon Rosario and a smaller Petache were found stranded at the dry Tortugas. The ships that had survived the storm returned to Havana and alerted everyone there to what had happened. An account of the disaster was written, including a tally of the dead, and the news was sent to Spain. A funeral procession was held in Havana for the dead recovered from Santa Margarita. Father Joseph Arriaga was one of those dead, and he was buried in a tomb bearing this epitaph: "Here lies the servant of Jesus Christ and very Christian Father, Joseph de Arriaga." Evidence of the wrecks was found as far away as the east coast of Florida. The Indians of Santa Lucia and Jaega, near today's Palm Beach, reported to the governor of St. Augustine that they had found wreckage on the beaches there. Troops were sent to investigate, and they found broken boxes, bales of tobacco, and 3 ships' boats. A rescue ship was dispatched from St. Augustine and sailed as far as Tampa to search for survivors. It then sailed to the Bahamas to see if anything or anyone was on those islands. A salvage team from Havana was organized and a recovery base was established at the Cabeza de los Martires, the head of the Florida Keys. The team was led by Gaspar de Vargas and included divers from Acapulco. They located and salvaged the galleon Rosario and other ships in the Dry Tortugas. They found Atocha and Margarita and recovered a few items from those ships, including 2 cannon from Atocha. The team was hit by another storm on October 4th, and after that they struggled to find any more evidence of the wrecks. On November 2nd, Don Pedro de Ursua also went to the Keys from Havana to search for the galleons. He found nothing but the side of the Atocha, as he described it, on land. It was then that they began to realize the October storm had broken the Atocha to pieces. The Marquez or Marquis de Cadereyta, the commander of the 1622 Tierra Firme fleet, was growing impatient with the progress of the recovery, and he came to the Keys himself to oversee the salvage effort. A man named Nicolas de Cardona, who worked with Gaspar de Vargas in 1623 to help salvage the shipwrecks, he documented the effort, and he wrote of what they did. The Cabeza de los Martires is the southernmost part of Florida. It is a dangerous place, for there have been drowned in it an infinite number of souls, and for this reason they call it the Martires, or the Martyrs. The year of 1622, there were lost in this place 3 silver galleons of the command of the Marquis de Cadereyta and other ships of the fleet, in which perished many souls and fortunes. The Almirante of Tierra Firme, with more than 1,000,000 pesos, was lost in 55 feet of water. The galleon Margarita in 25 feet on a rocky outcropping, and that of General Chazareta in Tortuga in 16 feet of water, along with other private ships. This year of 1623, the Viceroy of New Spain sent me from the port of Acapulco in the South Sea with 14 Negro divers and instruments to Havana to help seek this treasure. I took part in company with the Marquis of Cadereyta, Captain Gaspar de Vargas, and Don Pedro de Ursua, searching for it in the Keys of Matacumbe and in the sandbanks. Even though we found the hull of the 2 galleons and salvaged from them many muskets, barrels of shot, ballast, and some silver bars, we could not come up with the main treasure because of the bad weather, even though we worked with the greatest of care. In August of 1623, Gaspar de Vargas notified the governor of Cuba that he and his team had been defeated by the deep sands in the waters of the Martires. In an interesting side note, the islands nearest the wrecks, because of the presence of the Marquis of Cadereyta, who was there to oversee the salvage, those islands began to be referred to as the Cayos del Marqués, This was crucial for the modern search for the shipwrecks because that name persists today as the Marquesas Keys. In December of 1624, an official from Havana named Francisco Núñez Melián was granted a salvage contract for the shipwrecks. Under the agreement, 1/3 of anything found would go to the Crown, 1/3 would go to Melián himself, and the other third was to be used for expenses. An initial 1625 effort was put together, and a team of salvagers left from Havana, but they vanished at sea and never returned. In May of 1626, a larger effort was organized, and under this one, Melián, along with his lieutenants, 59 sailors, 3 servants, and 13 enslaved divers, took a ship, a frigate, a brigantine, a longboat, a tender, and 4 canoes, and as was written, in occupying the last key which they called Del Marqués, they went ashore and caused a house to be built to be secure from the Indians of the Florida coast, many of whom came and with arrows and other warlike instruments vexed them. So they spent quite a bit of time actually trading and interacting with the native peoples of the Florida Keys, largely as a way to placate them and keep them from interfering with the salvage effort. Melián's team worked this way. They would mark off a search area and then systematically drag that area with weighted lines and grapnel hooks, hoping to snag onto wreckage. The team also employed what was then the revolutionary technology of a diving bell. Melián had cast in Havana a bronze bell, 4 feet tall, 3 feet in diameter. It weighed 700 pounds and had iron ballast, legs, and seats. He claimed it could hold 3 divers. And what he wrote about it says, "When it falls upon the water, not a drop of water can come in until arriving at the sea bottom and resting upon its feet, it then receives some, but in such a way that more than the upper half remains empty and full of air, a refuge and breathing place for the divers who go out from it onto the sea bottom to work. And then, becoming tired, they return to the bell, where they take new spirit, an admirable natural philosophy and one practiced by few." That summer of 1626, on Santa Margarita specifically, Melián's team found 350 silver bars, 74,750 pesos in silver coins, 8 pieces of bronze artillery, and 109 copper ingots. Tremendous success. Also, freedom had been promised to the first enslaved diver to find a silver bar, and that promise was kept, and it was given to the diver who did so, a man named Juan Bañón. Melián's team traveled back and forth to Havana because of bad weather or the need for supplies, and on a return in early 1627, they found that the Keys natives had burned down their house. And that wasn't their only problem. Dutch corsairs were making inroads into the Spanish colonies, and they were raiding Spanish ships and towns, and one of Melián's salvage teams was taken hostage by Dutch interlopers and turned over to the Indians of the Florida Keys, and Melián had to pay a ransom of ceramics, hatchets, and knives to free the crew. The Dutch kept coming, and the Spanish salvagers increasingly armed themselves. Skirmishes ensued between the groups, but ultimately the salvagers were forced to flee to Havana. In 1628, the team returned, and they worked from April through September dragging in deeper waters, 30 to 60 feet deep, looking for Atocha. And again, as was written, it says, with the two long boats they would go dragging with hemp lines, weighted with cannonballs and stones, rowing, diminishing the search area bit by bit and leaving buoys. Leaving off the said dragging, they would then work by putting divers down. Unfortunately, nothing was found, and more Dutch interlopers came and ultimately chased them off. In 1630, Francisco Núñez Melián was named governor of Venezuela, and he left Havana for South America. His lieutenants carried on the salvage efforts, though, in a smaller way, through 1631. Then things ended for a while. In 1639, though, Governor Riano of Cuba sent a man named Lázaro Fáñez de Minaya to search for the shipwrecks, but he had no luck. Francisco Núñez Melián returned in 1642, and he found some hull remains in shallow water, but nothing of value, and his renewed effort ended in 1643. That put the salvage efforts on hold for a while, but the sunken galleons were never really forgotten. And in 1678, King Charles II granted a license to a man named Isidro de Mayorga to search for Atocha. Mayorga left in mid-August from Havana, traveled to Bahia Honda in the Florida Keys, and recruited 2 native divers there. They then sailed to Cayo de Piñero, probably Big Pine Key, and recruited 9 native divers there. The team then went in a frigate with 4 Indian canoes to a spot 3 to 4 leagues west of the Cayos del Marqués. 4 crewmen and a Greek diver went in canoes, and they started diving where the wreck was supposed to be, but they had no luck. A strange sail approached on the horizon, so the searchers left, and they went to Cayo de Piñero for safety. There, Mayorga met 2 Indian men who said that they had harpooned a turtle in the area of the shipwreck, and their line snagged on the bottom. They dove to free it, and in doing so they saw it was caught on a ballast pile, and that ballast pile had either a mast or a cannon sitting on top of it. Mayorga was inspired by this, and his team tried to return to the site, but poor weather kept them away. They made 2 more trips from Havana, but bad weather continued to impede the progress, and they finally just gave up. And this, in 1678, was the last effort to salvage the 1622 ships in the Spanish colonial period. Time marched on. In 1733, the New Spain fleet wrecked in the Upper Keys. In the later 1700s, the last of the native Keys peoples were sent by the Spanish to Cuba. In 1819, Florida was ceded by Spain to the United States. The Florida Keys became a U.S. territory in 1822, and Key West was founded at that time. The story of the disaster of 1622 was not forgotten. It continued to be told in both Spanish and U.S. history books, and here we see examples from 1776, 1819, and 1921. In 1960, another account of the 1622 fleet was published in the Treasure Diver's Guide by John Potter. It was this version of the events that inspired the Florida treasure hunter Mel Fisher to begin a search for the lost galleons in 1969. With Eugene Lyon's assistance, Fisher utilized the extensive records left by the Spanish to guide his pursuit. In 1971, the first evidence of Atocha was found. In 1980, Santa Margarita was located. And in 1985, after a search as difficult as anything experienced by the Spanish, the long-lost cargo hold of Atocha was finally discovered. And with those finds, the story of the Tierra Firme fleet was resurrected, and its secrets, held under the sea for centuries, could finally be revealed. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this presentation and found it informative. To learn more about the 1622 galleons in our museum, please see our website, melfisher.org.